I would like to thank Rabbi Rapport and Rabbi Citron for putting together this delightful event, and to David Newton for co-chairing and being the shadchan, the matchmaker, who connected me with this wonderful opportunity to teach and learn together here in community. I'd like to thank JCC Manhattan and the Carlebach Shul for co-hosting this special event, this annual Day of Kabbalah, and my hope is that it leads only to more beautiful opportunities to get together and learn. It is my deepest pleasure to be together with each of you here on this exquisite journey. Let us begin. What if everything that you thought about God, the world, and yourself was wrong? I'd like to embark on a journey together throughout time to explore the daring ideas of three giants of Jewish thought, Maimonides, Spinoza, and the Baal Shem Tov, to see how each of these thinkers grappled with the boundaries between God and the world, and hopefully together discover the profound implications of their revolutionary conclusions for us here and now today. In 1232, the leading rabbis in northern France placed a strict ban on Maimonides' works, leading to the burning of his philosophical magnum opus, The Guide for the Perplexed, later that same year in a public square in Paris. It was burnt by the Dominicans at the behest of the French rabbis who were not happy with Maimonides' writings. 424 years later, in 1656, a young Jew by the name of Baruch Spinoza was excommunicated and thrown out of his community by the rabbis of the Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam. 116 years later, in 1772, the young Hasidic movement, the students of the Baal Shem Tov, were placed under cherem, excommunication, by the leading rabbinic authorities of Lithuanian Jewry. What was it that these three men had written and taught that was so dangerous, so threatening, that the religious establishments of their day had to burn their books, place them under severe ban of cherem, and throw them out of the community? To answer this question, we have to journey back to the 13th century, to the great Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon. Maimonides, besides for being one of the great halachic jurists of his day and of all time, was also grappling with profound philosophical questions. In response to a series of questions from one of his students, Maimonides writes one of, if not the greatest work of Jewish philosophy of all time, Moreh Nevuchim, The Guide for the Perplexed. In the guide, Maimonides seeks to clarify questions of prophecy and providence, creation and emanation, free will and divine omniscience. But above all, Maimonides is concerned with persuading his reader towards a correct understanding of the nature of God. Maimonides labors at great length to teach his reader how to read Tanakh, how to read Chumash, how to read the Bible properly, moving us away from simplistic, childlike, anthropomorphic conceptions of God towards a mature, sophisticated understanding of God. Not a simple process. Maimonides eventually leads the reader to what's referred to as a position of negative theology. I'm going to be throwing in some of the technical terminology that we find in the historical and philosophical jargon, and I'll try to explain as we go along. Negative theology simply is the belief that all that can be correctly asserted about God is the negation of whatever we thought we could say about God. So we cannot even say that God is good, we can only say God is not evil, for example. It's really an austere and demanding theological project which Maimonides undertakes, and one which ends up with a very different looking God than the God that we were taught about as children. It's a God that is reached through negation, through negating anything which we thought we could say, and only at the end of all those final negations do we come to a concept devoid of all of our positive articulations, which might be an appropriate thing to say about God, which is very little. Maimonides sees the primary spiritual and intellectual responsibility in life to mature and develop a correct understanding of God, one which for Maimonides is not simply a logical, metaphysical project, but one which culminates in an ecstatic, unending intimacy and merger of minds between the human and God, as Maimonides describes in Part 3, Chapter 51 of the Guide, which crescendos into a synthesis of knowledge and action, justice and humility. As Maimonides famously ends the guide with a quote from the prophet Jeremiah. Thus says the Lord, let not the wise boast of their wisdom, nor the strong boast of their strength, nor the rich of their riches. Ki im bezois yishalel hamishallel, but let the one who boasts boast about this. Haskel v'yoda oisi, that they know and understand me, says God. Ki ani Hashem oise chesed o mishpat utzedakah ba'aretz, ki ba'elech chafatzti ne'um Adonai, for I am God who exercises kindness and justice, righteousness upon the earth. For in these I delight, declares the Lord. Maimonides, following the biblical injunction, calls us to imitate God, imitato Dei, a God about whom we can say nothing, but we can only encounter and emulate through God's actions and our actions. Maimonides, throughout the guide, is grappling with this tension between a God we cannot possibly know and a God who must interact with the world and therefore in some way be encounterable and knowable. In Maimonides' philosophy, building off Jewish, Muslim, and Greek philosophers who preceded him, God thinks the world into being through a series of agent intellects, effectively turning this world into a thought in the mind of God, and opens the possibility for the human to ascend this ladder back up into the mind of God, so to speak, what Maimonides would call prophecy. Maimonides posits a cosmic continuum, a cognitive bridge between God and the world, through which the human can ascend and through which God can reveal. For Maimonides, as for his hero Aristotle, cognition implies union. To know something is, for the immaterial mind, to become the form of the object that it is thinking about. To know something truly is to be that thing. Knowing is being. This is not a modern conception, but for medieval and ancient thinkers, this was commonplace. For Maimonides, then, in the act of cognizing the world into existence, via the intellectual overflow emanating from the divine intellects, God is in some way properly one and united with the world. And this notion of God's overwhelming cognitive unity with the world is not some obscure metaphysical point for Maimonides. It's actually fundamental to his thinking, and it underpins not only his conceptions of revelation, prophecy, and providence, but Maimonides' very conception of divine unity rests upon this idea. For if the world was properly metaphysically separate from God, we would be positing something outside of God, in addition to God, which we cannot do. If we believe, as Maimonides does, that God is truly one, solitary, and infinite. As Maimonides writes in his opening chapters of his halachic magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, Hu levado ha'emes ve'ein la'achar emes kamitase, God alone is true, and nothing else has true existence like God. V'hu sha'Torah imeres, and this is what the Torah says in Deuteronomy chapter 4, Ein oid milvado, there is nothing but God, kulemar ein sham motzi emes milvado k'maise, that there is besides for God, there is no true existence. This understanding of Maimonides, particularly in the context of Aristotelian epistemology, which is Aristotle's theory of knowledge, adds a whole new dimension to the Maimonidean claim that God is the knower, the knowing, and the known, all as one. Maimonides writes, God does not know with a knowledge which is external to God. Rather, God, God's knowledge, and God's life are one from all angles in all possible ways of unity. Thus we can say God is the knowing subject, God is the known object, and God is the knowledge itself. Hakol echad, all is one, all as one. God knows the creations insofar as God knows God's self, writes Maimonides. Thus, since God knows God's self, God knows everything, for everything depends upon God for its existence. This is what Maimonides writes in the beginning of Mishnah Torah. In the opening, the foundations of the Torah, Maimonides is writing what the Jew must believe. The audacity of Maimonides' theological vision, radically rethinking the very constitution of God, which demands chapters of complex hermeneutical exploration to show that it does not stand in contravention to the biblical depictions of God, may have been just too much for his conservative colleagues to bear, and some short 40 years after Maimonides' guide was disseminated, first in Egypt, North Africa, and in Spain, its pages sadly rose on the flames above the crowds of those who watched it burn in the streets of Paris. But the story of those who were smitten with the need and desire to understand God would not be snuffed out by those flames. The journey continues. The journey to understand God continues 4 centuries after Maimonides wrote with a distant disciple of Maimonides, a man by the name of Baruch Spinoza, who would carry his thinking even further. In his magnum opus, The Ethics, which Spinoza seemingly wrote with Maimonides' guide open in front of him on the table, Spinoza, in opposition to his predecessor, René Descartes, who put an ontological split between mind and matter, Spinoza argues that there is and can only be one substance that is absolutely infinite, self-caused, and eternal. Spinoza calls this substance Deus sive natura, God or nature, considering the two terms to be synonymous. Spinoza forcefully argues that all of reality is comprised of this one substance, and its attributes, thought and extension, what we might call mind and matter, and its modes, the particular instantiations of substance through these attributes of mind and matter, of thought and extension. And because all that exists on Spinoza's account is one single, unified, indivisible substance, there cannot be for him any true ontological separation between God and nature, spirit and matter, body and soul. The technical term for Spinoza's philosophy is a pantheistic dual-aspect monism. Namely, I'll translate that for the people that don't speak academic gibberish, namely a belief that everything is God, everything is one, and that the dualism that we perceive in reality are but two aspects of an underlying unity which is God, two sides of the same divine coin of which everything is comprised, which Spinoza calls substance, God or nature. Spinoza's epistemology, psychology, moral philosophy, political philosophy, and philosophy of religion all flow naturally from this starting point. It is the metaphysical bedrock of Spinoza's ethics which leads to all his conclusions. Spinoza takes his reader on a challenging, rigorous journey, a tour de force of philosophy, which he ultimately saw as a spiritual practice that, properly practiced, leads one to a life of happiness and liberation. Through freeing our minds and coming to a proper conception of God and reality, an intuitive understanding of the inherent structure of nature, a scientia intuitiva, one in which all that happens must happen exactly as it happens, perceiving all under the aspect of eternity sub species eternitatis, through a God's eye view, we can reach a state of mind which Spinoza calls blessedness at the very end of the Ethics, a reflection of his own name, Baruch, Benedictus, a blessing. Spinoza's God, built certainly clearly upon the foundations of Maimonides' God, is simply that which is. The goal of our lives for Spinoza, if they shall be blessed, is to contemplate God, to be wrapped in what he calls an intellectual love of God, an amor die intellectualis, an ahava elohit sichlit, the intellectual love of the mind towards God, and the very love of God by which God loves God's self, as Spinoza writes. Because there is only one mind which can love itself. Spinoza paradoxically calls us to cultivate a love towards a thing immutable and eternal, which we in reality already fully possess. And in his beckoning to love God, in God's self-love, we hear the echoes of Maimonides. This love, writes Maimonides, is proportionate to the intellectual apprehension of God. Thus, it is clear that a person ought to aim to have constant love and devotion towards God through the apprehension of the intellect. Spinoza's radical conclusions, although beloved by many, including myself until today, faced a harsh reception in his own day. He was called an atheist and a heretic. His works were said to have been forged in hell by an apostate Jew and the devil himself, which, if you ask me, is not too bad of a collab. Sadly, on the 27th of July, the 6th of 1656, Spinoza was formally evicted and excommunicated from the Jewish community with a very harsh writ of cherem. Spinoza's reputation and legacy, however, was complex and divided. He was accused by his contemporaries of being a subversive atheist. In fact, a century after Spinoza's death, there broke out what was known as the pantheismostrite, the pantheism controversy, which was this kind of elite culture wars in which to be accused of being a Spinozist was tantamount to being called an atheist and having one's reputation and teaching position called into jeopardy. And yet, Spinoza was also famously called by the famous German poet Novalis, der Gott betrunkene Mensch, the God-intoxicated man. How, we might ask, can one both be drunk on God and an atheist? As it turns out, between a God who is everything and a God who is nothing lies a fine line, a line upon which many have been strung. In the hills of the Carpathian Mountains lived a young man. He was known as the master of the good name, a man still shrouded in mystery till today, some seeing him as a mighty shaman, a powerful healer, others as a humble, wandering preacher and school caretaker. Whatever the truth is, we now know his name as Yisrael ben Eliezer, Yisrael the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name, the legendary father of the Hasidic movement, the most successful Jewish mystical revival of all time. Born just 2 decades after Spinoza's death, and despite presumably never having read him, the Baal Shem Tov's thinking developed on remarkably similar lines to Spinoza's, with some very important differences. And we will be speaking both about those similarities and differences. Spinoza and the Baal Shem Tov certainly had some shared sources that they were reading, Maimonides, the Rambam being the most obvious one, but there's a strong possibility that Spinoza was exposed to another corpus of text which the Baal Shem Tov's thinking was deeply, deeply indebted to, namely Kabbalah. Specifically, the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria, as filtered in Spinoza's instance through Luria's student Yisrael Sarug and his student Avram Cohen de Herrera. Herrera's dates are 1570 to about 1635. Herrera, as far as we know, is the first Kabbalist in history to coin the Kabbalistic doctrine, the phrase of Tzimtzum Lav Kipshutai, namely that the doctrine of Tzimtzum, of divine self-contraction, espoused by the great Isaac Luria, perhaps the most influential Kabbalist of all of history, that this doctrine of Tzimtzum, which we'll explain in just a second, was not to be read literally, but rather figuratively. Namely, that the pre-cosmic event of God, the infinite Ein Sof, pulling itself aside to leave a void, an empty space and canvas for the beginnings of creation, without which no perception of a separated created existence could come into being, because anything that would try come into being or be brought into being would be nullified in the all-consuming presence of the infinite divine being. This process of divine self-contraction, of the infinite making space inside itself for the finite, a cornerstone of Luria's magnificent theology, must be read as having occurred merely figuratively. This is what it means to read it Lav Kipshutai. And the way to correctly read Luria's doctrine of Tzimtzum was a matter of intense dispute amongst his students. Those like Herrera, the student of Sarug, who argued for a non-literal reading, Tzimtzum Lav Kipshutai, Tzimtzum non-literal, were effectively arguing that God in reality, from God's point of view, never really evacuated the void necessary for the act of creation. God never left the garden that would go on to become the canvas of creation, that God always was and therefore is always still here and right now in every moment. A radical immanentist position, seen by these thinkers to be supported by key articulations in the Zohar, which predates Luria, which audaciously claims late atar panui minei, there is no place in existence devoid of you, devoid of God, and I husevev kol amen umamali kol amen, you God surround all worlds and fill all worlds. As the prophet Isaiah himself says, the whole world is filled with the glory of God. This reading of Luria's doctrine of Tzimtzum as non-literal means that even when God creates a void for creation, the void is never really void of God, which means that creation is never void of God, that God is fully present in creation. despite what seems from our perspective to be the absence of God created in Tzimtzum. Research has also shown that Spinoza was likely reading Kabbalists like Herrera, who supposedly, while doing, this is a crazy story, while doing some work for the Sultan, was kidnapped by pirates, Herrera the Kabbalist, pirates that were working apparently for the Queen, Queen Elizabeth I, and after some lengthy royal negotiations was finally released to the shores of Amsterdam by some lucky stroke of history, where he would go on to publish, Herrera would publish the very first works of Kabbalah ever written in the vernacular Spanish, translated later into Hebrew, Shar Shamayim and Beis Elohim, only a stone's throw away from the young stomping grounds of a precocious, curious child, Baruch Spinoza. It's very likely, in fact, that Herrera's students, when he arrived finally in Amsterdam, would go on to be the teachers of Spinoza in his Talmud Torah when he was a young boy. And the writings of Spinoza and the Ethics, when read side by side with Herrera's Kabbalistic writings, show tremendous affinity that make it very hard to believe that Spinoza was not reading Herrera's Kabbalah, therefore exposed to not just the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria, but specifically this highly immanentist position of Tzimtzum Lav Kapshote, of a non-literal Tzimtzum. Now, we don't know if the Baal Shem Tov had access to Herrera's writings, although we know certainly that his followers did, and they quote him generations down the line. But what we do know is that the Baal Shem Tov's reading of Tzimtzum was one which he shared with Herrera, a radical reading of Luria's Tzimtzum as non-literal, leading the Baal Shem Tov to espouse a parallel philosophy to Spinoza's, of a God who is deeply present in all things, a God who never abandoned the world, who never was nor could be separate from it. For God, for the Baal Shem Tov, as for Spinoza, was the very substance of reality, the being of our being in all its glistening mystery and shining infinitude. However, the similarities between Spinoza and the Baal Shem Tov have their limits. Whereas for Spinoza, God is impersonal, is not, and cannot be moved by our tears or prayers. Spinoza writes that he who loves God cannot strive that God should love him in return. For Baal Shem Tov, God is deeply personal and caring, deeply involved and affected by the actions of the human. In some ways, God even relies upon the human for continued sustenance, meaning, and relevance. The Baal Shem Tov conception of divine unity, encapsulated in his rallying cry from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, Ein Od Milvadai, there is nothing other than God, the same verse we saw quoted earlier by Maimonides, taken by the Baal Shem Tov to mean that there exists nothing outside of God, that all of reality is God. And the Baal Shem Tov does not shy away from stating this in emphatic, unmistakable terms. In Yiddish, the Baal Shem Tov says, Gott is Alts und Alts is Gott, God is all and all is God. Not all that different from Spinoza's whatever is in God and nothing can be or be conceived without God. But the Baal Shem Tov takes Spinoza's rigid pantheistic monism and creates something deeply relational, reciprocal, and participatory. The Baal Shem Tov takes what would otherwise be a highly abstract philosophical system and turns it into a deeply personal experience, a striving for intimacy and union with the divine. The Baal Shem Tov bequeaths us not just with a brilliant schema of reality, but a lived relationship with divinity and a set of transformative spiritual practices, and most importantly, perhaps, the interpersonal relationships between master and disciple, and inside the community of devotees striving for divinity, within and through which we transform our lives into living relationships with the infinite, as mediated through the thick particularism of the living Jewish tradition. From a technical standpoint, if Spinoza's philosophical system is pantheistic, namely pan, all, theos, God, all is God, then the Baal Shem Tov's system, insofar as we can call it a system, would be called panentheistic, namely all is God and in God. Namely that God isn't just synonymous with the totality of perceivable and conceivable reality, but that God, in some meaningful way, is more than our reality. God, in some ways, transcends and encompasses our universe. God is not just being, but also the ground of being, to quote the great 13th century Christian mystic Meister Eckhart. God in the Baal Shem Tov's language is not just that which is Mamali Kol Almin, which fills all worlds, but God is also Soivev Kol Almin. Using the language of the Zohar, God also surrounds and encompasses, holds all worlds. Or in the language of the rabbis in the Medrash Bereshis Rabbah, commenting on one of the names of God, Hamakom, the omnipresent, literally the place, one of the names that the rabbis call God. And the Medrash says, the reason why God is called Hamakom is because Shehu Mekomo Shel Olam Ve'ein Olam Mekomo, that the world, that God is the place of the world, but the world is not the place of God. Namely, that God encompasses the world, but the world does not contain and encompass the totality of God. This rabbinic notion of a panentheistic God is encapsulated poetically in perhaps the most beautiful lines in Chumash, where Moses asks to see the face of God. Harini nat kvodecha, show me your glory, says Moses. And God says, Lo yireni adam v'chai, no person can see me and live. And God eventually capitulates to Moses to give Moses a glimpse of the divine glory with three very beautiful words, Hine makom iti, here there is place with me, here there is space with me. The God from the biblical, rabbinic, and Baal Shem Tov perspective is not simply synonymous with the world, but it is a God who has space for the world as well. Pantheism, everything is God. Panentheism, everything is God and in God. For this democratization of the divine, for taking the supreme mysteries and supernal secrets of Kabbalah, of a God who dwells within our thoughts, speech, and actions, and making them commonplace, taking the rarest jewel and offering it to the unlettered and the unprepared, the Baal Shem Tov and his disciples faced tremendous backlash and fierce opposition from the rabbinic establishment of their day. In 1772, the year that Dovber, the Maggid of Mizrich, the student of the Baal Shem Tov and the architect, really, of the Chassidic movement, passed away, and the very same year that the fiery Reb Nachman of Breslov was born, in that very same year, in 1772, the young Chassidic movement was for the first time placed under cherem, excommunicated by the leading rabbinic authorities of Lithuanian Jewry. The cherem and the subsequent ideological wars between these groups, which lasted for close to a century, tore families and communities apart, with serious and dire consequences for those caught on its fault lines and between its crosshairs. And while the conflict which ensued, as things of this nature often do, took on all different shapes and motivations, from the petty to the pious, the origins, as attested by the manuscript documentation, lay in questions of theology and how we ought to properly understand and, more importantly, teach about God and the relationship between God and the world. The battle lines of the conflict between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim, the Hasidim and their opponents, lay over questions, for example, of how to properly understand Luria's doctrine of Tzimtzum that we discussed earlier and the implications that follow from it. We can see a clear example of this in the letters of excommunication written by the opposition movement. The Misnagdim, the opposition as they became known, they call themselves Hasidim, writes the letter. The pious, this is an abomination. How they have deceived this generation, uttering these words on high, these are thy gods, O Israel, Eile Elokecha Yisrael, every stick and stone, namely pantheism. They are wicked shepherds that fabricate a new law and a new Torah from their own hearts. Their disciples follow after them, and heaven's name is disgraced. Despite the vociferous opposition, or perhaps even partly in thanks to it, the young Hasidic movement continued to grow, emboldened on its mission to radically bring its radical notion of an immanent God to every Jew, no matter the degree of prior knowledge, learning, or training. On the contrary, one of the slogans of the early Hasidic movement was that in some ways the simplicity of the simple Jew more perfectly reflected the divine simplicity of God. More so even than the complex, sophisticated mind of the scholar, the simple heart of the simple Jew was an adequate dwelling place for the divine. Again, a radical break even from the dominant history of Kabbalah, in which divine wisdom was kept a secret for the scholarly elites. Part of what motivated the Baal Shem Tov in his radical mission to bring this esoteric hidden knowledge, which had been hidden for all of Jewish history, to the public, despite the staunch opposition and the very good reasons not to, was a vision that the Baal Shem Tov had of the Messiah, in which the Messiah informs the Baal Shem Tov that he would arrive on earth only when the Baal Shem Tov's teachings about God's unity had been spread to all corners of the world. It was these teachings, later Hasidic thinkers would add, that were the messianic consciousness, and that their dissemination would be the true messianic revelation that we've been waiting for all along, as prophesied by the prophet Isaiah about the end of days, repeated by Maimonides, the final words of his Mishnah Torah, Ki mala ha'aretz de'as Hashem k'mayim le'yem yachasim, for the world will be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea. There was initially, in the discussion of planning this class, supposed to be a fourth section here, which was going to explicate the thinking of a third great Jewish leader and mind, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and his thinking on the subject, who, in my estimation, really takes all of these ideas to their furthest radical conclusions. But frankly, where the Rebbe takes these conclusions with these notions of divine essence, atzmos, is, I think, really too potentially volatile and deconstructive to add here to the mix at this moment, and it felt a little irresponsible for me to include it without giving it its due justice with the limited time we have left. So we're going to have to bookmark the Rebbe's position and the Rebbe's thoughts on this issue, and hopefully come back to it another day. And I'd like to instead end with some questions, and then we will open up for questions from the audience, those who are joining us here today to learn. Let's begin with some simpler questions. Questions of what this radical rethinking of the concept of God, as found in Maimonides, Spinoza, and the Baal Shem Tov, each in their own way, poses for us in the realm of religion. If God and the world, God and us, are not fundamentally separate from one another, how can, and what does it mean, for example, to pray to God? Is there some God out there that can hear our prayers and be moved to intercede on our behalf? Can God pray to God's self? If God and the world, God and us, are not fundamentally separate from one another, how can and what does it mean that God can command us to act and behave in certain ways? Can one command oneself? What does it mean that God punishes and rewards those that abandon or follow God's instructions, as the Torah affirms many times? Is there somewhere other than here, other than this earth, an afterlife, a heaven, a hell, in which we can be punished or rewarded for abrogating God's will? And what does it even mean to transgress against God's will or abrogate God's will if we are fundamentally not other than God? Are we abrogating our own will by following our will against God's will? What choice might we have, if any, in any given instance, if all of our decisions aren't just already foreknown by God, but are actually God's decisions? As Spinoza might say, the human mind is part of the infinite intellect of God. Thus, when we say, says Spinoza, that the human mind perceives this or that, we are saying nothing other than God, insofar as God constitutes the essence of the human mind, has this or that idea. On those grounds, what space is there for human agency, choice, and therefore for punishment? How can we be punished or rewarded for something which we cannot choose? In what way can God, I'm not keeping track of the questions here, keeping count, but these are all natural questions which flow from this. In what way can God, who is not separate from this reality, perform miracles, abrogations of the ordinary order of nature? How can God witness, oversee, supervise, or administer providence over this world under this conception? And what does it mean on this account of God for God to reveal God's word or will to a prophet or a people? How can we speak of the word of God? Is that not just some sort of self-revelation? Now, to be fair, many, if not all, of these questions are already posed and responded to by the very thinkers that we've been discussing here, and they do so at great length. I don't want to give the impression that these questions are unanswered or unanswerable or even original, but I do think that they are good questions nonetheless, which move us to explore these subjects with greater depth and therefore are worth mentioning. But these questions, I think, are the easy questions, because it's not just religious questions that this conception of God naturally gives rise to. It gives rise to a whole host of serious and pressing ethical, emotional, existential questions. And I'd like to lay out some of those for you here as well, in no particular order. If God is all, then why is there so much suffering in this world? And this is a variation on a popular theological problem, the problem of evil. But instead of asking, how can an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God allow suffering in this world? The question here is different. The question is, how can we say of the suffering itself that it is God? And this is not just a question of large-scale tragedies and explicitly negative occurrences, sickness and poverty and famine. It's even a question of everyday, ordinary, undesirable aspects of one's quotidian emotional life, like loneliness, depression, boredom, anxiety, apathy, and feelings of emptiness. How do we feel those feelings if everything is God? What does it mean that everything in every moment is God, given our real experience of life with all of its complexity and all of its suffering? There's another, perhaps more philosophical question, but no less pressing, which is that if God is everything, then how do we establish and differentiate value? To say that something is better or worse, desirable or undesirable, is to posit some differentiation between things. Saying that everything is God seemingly flattens and equalizes all things in a way that makes it very difficult to say that anything is better or preferable over anything else. And on the ethical front, this flattening of all value can lead to some serious, dangerous transvaluation of values. If all is God, then what difference is there anymore between good and evil? This is a really serious issue, and one which has led in the history of Jewish mysticism to some very real issues in the real world, like, for example, the antinomian and intentionally transgressive Sabbatean and Frankist movements, in which religious violations and moral violations were committed for the sake of heaven. Blessed are you, God, who permits the forbidden matir isurim, is what they spoke and did. And on the emotional and psychological side of this, there's a whole host of issues which arise. If we take this conception of God seriously, it can lead one to dark places. If all things are of equal value, if all things are divine, then why do anything at all? There's seemingly nothing that can be improved, nothing that can be done wrong, and therefore nothing worth doing. Or more acutely, emotionally, one can find oneself overwhelmed and incapacitated by the overwhelming presence of God. A world saturated by ultimate being at every turn and drenched with absolute significance and meaning in each minute moment can be utterly terrifying and crippling. Rudolf Otto, the German thinker, rightfully referred to an encounter with the numinous divine as the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, a mystery before which one is both terrified and fascinated, repulsed and enticed. And Carl Jung appropriately quipped that the role of religion is to protect people against a direct experience of God. I think that this conception of God and reality can be thoroughly challenging and destabilizing. And I want to be honest here about that because I think that thinking that God and the world are one and indivisible can easily lead us into a hell of our own making. But this conception of God can also lead us in a different direction. It can move us to an incredible sense of belonging, a deep comfort, to know that we are always held in the presence of God like a child in their mother's womb, to use modern Buber's beautiful imagery. Knowing that our being is one with the infinite, as the Hasidic masters put it, that our soul is a chelek elika mimal mamash, that our soul is literally a part of God and a part of the infinite itself, by definition, is infinite. When meditated upon, that knowledge can impart a profound sense of interbeing, that we literally feel deeply interwoven from the same divine substance as the rest of reality that we encounter and experience. Our being is ontologically inseparable from all we encounter from one another, more inseparable even, right, the Hasidic masters, than the limbs of one body, because technically, limbs of one body can be severed from one another, but God cannot be severed from God, nor being from being, nor self from other. This conception, when taken seriously, leads to a profound realization, the experience of the Jewish value of arivut, a rich, word in Hebrew with a wide semantic range, hard to translate, but including and not limited to entanglement, mixed togetherness, intermingled, braided, mutual responsibility. Interbeing might suffice as a shorthand for this word arivut, a sense of deep belonging to one another, a sense of responsibility to love the other as oneself, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, as the Bible commands us, not just the other as oneself, but kamocha mamash, say the Chassidic masters, you love the other because they are yourself. This sense of interbeing and responsibility that extends not only to our fellow humans, but also to the more than human world, to all creatures filled and overflowing with the divine, to see that all of earth is crowned with heaven and every common bush aflame with God, to quote Elizabeth Barrett Browning. The ethical implications of this vision are clear both interpersonally and ecologically. The implications for constructing meaning, for combating things like loneliness, isolation, fear, and hatred are clear, obvious, and immense. There are many ways in many cultures to be a god. It's a fairly well-established trope, actually, historically. Typically, whatever the dominant culture depicts as God in the given culture, likewise consequently follows what it means to be a god for that culture. So if God is depicted as a mighty, vengeful warrior, then to be a god in that context might not be the prettiest thing. Luckily, Judaism, which has a plethora of divine images, calls us specifically to walk in God's ways, an enigmatic instruction littered throughout the Bible, and interpreted definitively by the rabbis as a call to specifically emulate certain representations of God and not others. Just as God is merciful, write the rabbis, so shall you be merciful. Just as God clothes the naked, visits the sick, and buries the dead, so shall you clothe the naked, visit the sick, and bury the dead, teach the rabbis. And those that embody these divine actions of kindness, care, and compassion, Judaism, as strange and as radical as it sounds, has no qualm calling these people gods. The Zohar, commenting on the biblical verse from the book of Exodus chapter 34, which mandates the triannual pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem, 3 times a year, says the verse, you shall come and appear before the face of God. The Zohar poses the question that in the absence of the temple in Jerusalem, where today is the face of God? And the Zohar bluntly answers, who is the face of God? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the great mystical protagonist of the Zohar, the face of God. Examples of this divinization of the human abound actually in Jewish literature, all the way from the apotheosis of Moses in Second Temple literature to the divinization of the tzaddik in Hasidism. It's just not what we're taught about in Jewish Sunday school, so it sounds very strange. But in reality, when one recognizes their body as a sacred dwelling place of divinity and allows their will to merge with the divine will, loving those things that God loves, loving kindness, justice, and righteousness, as the prophet Jeremiah tells us, then what distinction is there left between themselves, between ourselves, and the life that pulsates throughout all worlds? As the Hasidim radically read the prophet Isaiah, it is only your iniquities that cause separation between you and your God, namely that were, if it not for your iniquities, your own insecurities, self-limitations, and perceptions of separation, there would be nothing separating between you and God, for how can that which is truly infinite be anything other than what you are? There can be nothing which separates between the infinite and the self. God, in this radical conception, is, in the words of Nicholas of Cusa, none other than the none other, that which can never be alienated, never be othered, it is that which you always are. One who recognizes this, and more importantly in Judaism, embodies this in real, lived action, is called a merkava, a chariot to the divine will. When we live a life of kindness, we embody divinity, and our face becomes the face of the rider of the chariot. As Victor Hugo famously said, to love another is to see the face of God. In Judaism, to love another is to be the face of God. And through doing so, we take those small steps to making this world again a garden for God, a place where God and mankind can walk side by side in the garden as the Spirit of God rests upon the waters, because the day will come when the world shall be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea.
Zevi, we want to thank you for your gorgeous Torah. Friends, we have a little time for Q&A. If you have written questions, by all means, hold them up. Our volunteers will come and take them from you. Zevi, our first question asks, what, if any, is the role of meditation for these thinkers?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you. I want to bring the language into Judaism's own language to speak about it with the indigenous language of our own tradition. In the Hasidic tradition, which we ended with, the centrality of the Sphira of Dat, which is the third of the cognitive Sfirat, Chachma Bina Dat, is a place for which the Hasidic mystic identifies as a place of meditation. And simply put, meditation is that, or the Sphira of Dat, is that which takes that which is in the mind, the cognitive. We can talk about these ideas in abstraction, and we can sit here and we can think about them historically, and we can break them down. But in order to bring them down into our bodies, into our hearts, into our lungs, into our kishkis, into our chesed, into our gvura, we have to sit and meditate upon that. And within the Hasidic and Kabbalistic world, there are different forms of meditation. It's hitbeinenut, it's bodedut, and it's basically mediating these ideas from our mind into our heart and into our actions. Because without that, these ideas remain in our head and we remain very top-heavy. And as we said, the importance of this, both for Maimonides and for the Hasidic thinkers and for Spinoza, is to embody these ways of being and not just to think about them. And that happens through meditation.
Beautiful, thank you. On the subject of intellectual love of the infinite, how do we balance loving kindness, chesed, with rational, curious minds?
Sure. I think what's incredible for specifically these thinkers, and I think this is particularly evident with Maimonides and Spinoza, and the truth is that these are unique individuals, and they're in some ways they're speaking to unique individuals as well. Maimonides writes his guide to a single student. He's not writing to the public. He's very clear about that. But for Maimonides and Spinoza, it is through contemplation that we arouse love. Maimonides writes very clearly. Maimonides, remember, besides for being a great philosopher, is also a great halachist. And Maimonides reads the instruction, the commandment in the Bible to love God, v'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, as a commandment to contemplate upon God's creation and upon the nature of God, which brings to a love. For these thinkers, it is intellect which brings to emotion. And for the Chassidic thinkers, that's true as well. It is the attributes of chesed and gvura, the emotions which are the children, which are born from chachma and bina. Chachma and bina are the parents. And it is through contemplation that emotions are born. Now, this is a very particular articulation of Jewish thought and psychology, and there are other voices and thoughts. There's a very dominant position in Judaism that it's action actually which causes emotion and not thought. But for these thinkers, there is no separation at all between thought and emotion. It is thought which leads and causes emotion. And that's certainly true in both of those perspectives, that it's thought leads to emotion, action leads to emotion, and it's probably a question of finding one's own line and path within Judaism to arouse the correct emotions, whether that's through thought or through action.
The last question that somebody submitted in writing is, say more about physical and emotional pain and suffering, and how does Kabbalah talk about its acceptance and transformation?
That's a great question. You know, there are different ways of trying to frame what the project of Kabbalah is as a whole. There's, theological frameworks, there's philosophical, there's emotional frameworks. Philosophically, we can think about the project of Kabbalah as trying to explain the coexistence of the one and the many. How can the infinite coexist with the finite? How does God and the world, two things which are ontologically opposed to each other, how do they coexist? But from an emotional standpoint, there's a good case to be made that all of Kabbalah is trying to answer this question that's been raised of what do we do with pain and suffering? How do we live in a world of darkness? And Kabbalah is a system and way of thinking which does not shy away from darkness and pain. Central to Kabbalah, as we've been saying, is concealment, is tzimtzum, is absence, is hiddenness, is darkness. Another central motif in Kabbalah is shvirah, that there's brokenness, not just in our world, but there's brokenness in God. That God is broken, and it's our work to somehow try and heal God, to bring God back together. So Kabbalah, in many ways, faces and experiences this brokenness head on. And for historians of Kabbalah, Jews were going through the darkest times of Jewish history when the fundamental teachings of Kabbalah were being articulated, and perhaps in response to those challenges. And I think on one foot, I think that the answer of Kabbalah and Chassidut is firstly repeating that which they see from the rabbis, that as we've been saying today, and we see already this in Tanakh, that b'chol tzorisam leisar, that any pain that you experience, the divine is experiencing that pain too, that the Shekhinah is in Galut with the Jew who is in Galut, and the divine experiences that pain with you. That's firstly. And secondly, that you have the opportunity and the capacity to be an act of healing, not just for yourself, and not just for the world, but for God. And to me, that is the craziest statement that the Kabbalists make. The Kabbalists in the 16th century write a poem, Lichadodi, which it's become very popular, many people know and love. And one of the craziest lines there, and they're writing to a generation that has been thoroughly abused by everyone and by everything in this world. And the Kabbalists there write, that why the long face? Why are you so down? Why so broken? And the Kabbalist promises the reader who reads the poem, not only will you be in a place of healing and wholeness, but bach yechsun ani almi, that you will become a refuge for the healing, for the hurting, and for the broken. And this vision that we become a refuge not only for ourselves, for each other, and for the divine, is, I think, the way that the Kabbalists and the Hasidic masters grapple with this question of suffering and pain.
Thank you, Zevi. Thank you for your virtual and also your deeply felt presence in our day of Kabbalah today. And thank you to everybody who joined us on Zoom for this wonderful presentation. A round of applause in person and online for Zevi. Please discover his incredible project, Seekers of Unity, and learn more of his Torah. So I'm going to hand it off to Rabbi Citrin to talk about your choices of the next sessions in person.